Kia ora and welcome to the programme. You're watching GREG, the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative, webinar episode 7 of 7. So here at GREG House, there's a bit of an end of term feeling here. My name's Ian Kaplan and it's a pleasure and privilege to welcome you to the final episode of our suite of conference products. 2021 GREG conference ends here with 7 webinars and 5 companion films which have already been released into the public domain through the GREG website, all taken together on the theme of conversations. That is, conversations that really help regulatory practice and regulatory stewardship. We had a lot of conversations over the last fortnight, and I hope, members of the audience, you've enjoyed being part of them. You are very much part of them. Today, we're talking about the public and private conversations, and we know about some of the stories that emanate from private and public and I guess corporate concern of attention that can arise, but it is possible for government and business to get it right. How is it done? The regulatory world is a hugely broad church. A number of the regulated parties that we've discussed, whether they're international corporations or farms or whatever they are, all indulge from time to time in the need for something from government where there is a public-private mixture. That's why our guests are very highly placed to help us with today's proceedings. But before I do that, I'm just going to sort of dwell on some of the things that you can do to take part in this conversation, as has been possible throughout the entire series. At the foot of the screen, members of the audience, we've got the Q&A function. We'll be able to talk to our guests, ask questions of our guests, or if you want to make a statement, a comment, you can put it through the Q&A function. But the other conversations that we found are really working also, going on, as it were, in the background, but very much alive, are the conversations that you can have with each other, members of the audience, through the chat function. It's not rude to have a chat with each other while a webinar is going on. It's very different in the 2D world to the 3D world. It's a proxy, if you like, in, I guess, the webinar conference environment for having a cup of tea or the networking outside, and it's the closest in that sense we can get to it. Now, a number of our regulated parties, as I say, include international entities and digital markets, but they also include rats, possums and stoats. And today we're talking about osprey, not the fish-eating bird of prey with a cosmopolitan range and a 2-meter wingspan, but rather the private company in a partnership that we'll very much see is airborne. And I'm not going to go into any more kind of bird puns unless I'm directed otherwise by you or my guests. We're joined by Deb Despard, who's a senior manager of regulatory systems at WorkSafe, Kevin Forward of Osprey, the head of traceability there. MPI, partner with Osprey, Gray Harrison, joins us. He's the national manager of animal welfare and national animal identification and tracing. Nate, we're going to come to all of you in just a second, colleagues. Thank you, first of all, for joining us in episode 7. I think we're going to have some interesting conversations, and if I may say so, a bit of fun today. I should just mention that some of the backgrounds that have been chosen are royalty and copyright free, and I know Gray will probably explain in particular why his is very much royalty and copyright free when the time comes. But first of all, Deb, over to you and welcome. Just in terms of, we talk about traffic lights a lot in context these days, don't we? What do we look for as regulators in our contractual relationships? And the second limb of that question is, what are the green light relationships and what are the red ones?
Thanks, Ian. Kia ora koutou, everyone. It's really great to be here talking about this topic, this hot topic, if you like. It's an interesting question for regulators as to how we navigate this territory. Ian, to answer your question, I think it's really helpful for regulators to have third-party arrangements in place. And what I think it means is that it helps the regulator do its mahi. So quite often regulators look for help in terms of technical complexity or volume or some other reason that they know that they can better outsource their activities. And when I think about whether the lights are green or red, a green light scenario for me would be around the work of the third party being complementary to the regulator, if you like, an extension of them, and understanding risk and decision making and kind of acting as if a regulator would in many ways. When it comes to red lights, though, I think that third parties or the outsourcing type of arrangements can be influenced by profit incentives, regulatory capture with the industry, which can impact on decision making, and having regard to the part that the third party plays in the system. The other thing to bear in mind is that the regulator always remains the regulator. It can never distance itself from that, both the risks and the rewards of being a regulator. We must understand the quality and standards that are delivered by the party. They need to be in keeping with good practice. They need to be helping us contribute to the outcomes of our regime. And I think that means for me that we need to be good custodians of it. There's three things around that custodian aspect to me. It's authorise the party well, monitor it well, and manage the relationships well.
That, Deb, I think that's a very good primer to looking at the generality and also the specific nature of this relationship. If I go back a few episodes to Martial Boo from the UK's Institute of Regulatory Practice and also the Equality Commission, and his previous work, the public sector fox, not to anchor this too much to animals, but again, he was talking about regulatory entrepreneurialism. It was a theme that we visited last year in the conference with Professor Jeroen van der Heyden, who also appeared with Martial actually this year. Regulatory entrepreneurialism, that regulators needn't be shy of being entrepreneurs and partnering up so far as it's appropriate and proper. I'm going to go straight now to Kevin and Gray to talk about the OSPRI structure and relationship. Kevin, good morning to you. How does the partnership, delegation, power sharing structure, etc., work, I guess, in legislative terms?
Look, Ian, I might just actually cut in there just to give a little bit of context, because apparently there's a rural and urban divide going on. And so on the assumption that most of the people listening in are going to be urban, just what is the NAIT scheme for a start off? National Animal Identification and Tracing Scheme, set up in 2012, or should I say the act that underpins it was set up in 2012. What's it for? It's to trace animals, but when I say animals, it's only cattle and deer. What's the purpose of the scheme? If there's a biosecurity outbreak, we've got a great big database in place that we can trace and or backtrace all the movements of animals. When I say animals, again, cattle and deer across New Zealand. Who are the participants in the scheme? Basically all farmers, but there are some other big players as well. So anybody that's going to have those cattle or deer across their locations, and that includes meatworks, sale yards, as some of the other big players, they have to link into the scheme, they have to register themselves, they have to register their locations. All animals have to have the tags put into them, and the animals have to be individually registered, and all those people, farmers, meatworks, etc., sale yards, stock firms, have to record the movements of those animals. So I just wanted to get that out there, just in case some people are sitting there going, what is the NAIT scheme?
Yep, no, thank you very much.
And just to add to that, MPI is the responsible agency for it. And now I'll hand over to Kevin.
Kevin, over to you.
Cool, thanks for that. Can you hear me okay?
We've got you.
Cool. So OSPRI New Zealand is a parent company of two wholly owned subsidiaries, TB Free New Zealand and NAIT Limited. TB Free New Zealand is the management agency for the eradication of bovine tuberculosis under National Pest Management Plan under the Biosecurity Act. NAIT Limited is the NAIT organisation named under the NAIT Act. Now that's quite important differentiation there, because NAIT Limited as a named organisation under the NAIT Act actually has a co-regulatory status. It's quite unique in the fact we can actually set secondary legislation by standard, which is very unusual for an organisation. All three companies, so OSPRI is a parent company and its two wholly owned subsidiaries, are industry owned, not-for-profit private companies. So we have a board. Their board actually sits across all three, so it's three separate boards. But the shareholders of those companies are the three parties that are subject to the legislation. So that's Dairy Industry New Zealand, Dairy NZ representing dairy farmers, and Beef and Lamb New Zealand representing cattle farmers. It starts to raise a question then around industry self-regulation and how do you ensure that there's proper separation between the industry that's been regulated and then the influence that it can have over the co-regulator. And that's really where we have that separation between the responsible agency and the management agency. And as Deb brought up, making sure you've got the authorisation powers correct, but you've got that monitoring and oversight and evaluation correct. And when we start getting into those enforcement powers, even though the NAIT organisation has powers under the Act to enforce, we separate those out and work closely with Gray and his team and MPI where they do the enforcement. It raises some interesting questions at board level in regards to governance and responsibility, particularly when you've got farmer directors who are on the board, who are also subject to the requirements of the Act. So making sure that they're focusing clearly on governance and responsibility and not on enforcement aspects to it.
Thank you very much, Kevin and Gray, for that primer. I think there's a lot of sophisticated structural material there. You have a kind of, I guess, a sense of stakeholder driven and co-regulation, but the government is always there. Members of the audience, one of the things you might find of interest in the series of 5 films that accompany this, that are part of this conference, that accompany these webinars, is episode 2, where we feature fairly heavily the Port and Harbour Marine Safety Code, which is, I think, in a sense, an apex stakeholder model of its kind. And I can see certainly some resonances alongside that. Now, Gray, just diverting to you, and you should probably just tell us about the photo in the background, because one of the things, we are the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative, so we do make sure that we have rights cleared photography when we encourage a little competition, our panelists to have certain backgrounds. These are yours, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And so I've got a little farm of about a couple hundred acres up the coast. And look, the only thing I haven't managed to achieve today, listening to you before, is I should have actually sat out in the field so we could have got some of those moves going.
Location broadcasting. Let's just stick with the structure, and we'll come back, if we may, in a sec to you, Deb. We've just got a question coming in. Keep the questions coming in, members of the audience. I know that you are not shy. I've seen the registration list. We'll come back to the overall custodian point. I just want to stick with the structure, Gray and Kevin. When you look at how this works, what do you consider to be, traffic lights wise, a red light situation and a green light situation? And what's the secret sauce that makes it work for you?
Yeah, so I'll chip in there first, because so the scheme got underway in 2013, and of course MPI, responsible agency, but NAIT Limited sitting under Osprey being the management agency and having full power under the Act to carry out the compliance and monitoring and the regulation of the scheme. We sat back, MPI sat back and thought everything was going fine. Then, if you like, a big red light moment came along, and the Mycoplasma bovis outbreak in New Zealand came along in 2018. And that was the first time that the scheme, a la the database, the main database housing all the records of all the animals and all the movements, was going to be stress tested. The result was that uncovered that things weren't as they should be. So that was sort of the oh dear moment, and that's where we had to, start looking at it. And it wasn't hard at that point to realise that, gosh, something may have just gone wrong here. And then it was a matter of, okay, what do we need to go forward? And a quick analysis from the MPI side of things, as a responsible agency, what we should have been doing was having a much closer look into NAIT Limited. There was sort of superficial oversight, but we didn't get down to the detail. We didn't check, and that's where, from our perspective, I think we failed.
So we've got the red light situation, but there's a happy ending in that there's very much a green light moment and a secret sauce behind it. Yes.
So obviously, right, what are we going to do about this? And then a bit of restructuring when it occurred across at Osprey, and because Kevin came along, and the first green light moment is we got right people with the right skills and the right job, big emphasis on the skills that Kevin brought along there. And then it was about open and honest communication. There was no sort of sitting down and trying to hide what had occurred. We all said, look, it is what it is. How are we going to move forward? And so key points: regular, open, honest communication. It didn't matter. We could sit around the table. It didn't matter that I was from the responsible agency. It didn't matter that Kevin, for example, was from the management agency. It was just about, how do we make this work?
Kevin, let's bring you in on that one, if we may, because I mean, relationships, and this is something that resonates right throughout this series, whatever the sector, whatever the market, relationships are everything, aren't they?
Oh, completely. And I mean, just sort of going back to that time back in 2018 when I joined the scheme, the relationships between Osprey and MPI. I remember the first meeting on my first day, and it was like lobbing grenades. I sort of sat back and I think I was like, oh my God, what have I walked into? Coming from, a strong background in the public sector and having worked previously with New South Wales Police Force and forensics as a key client, I was grateful that at least at MPI, they didn't come wearing leathers and carrying Glocks to the meeting. So that was a lot better, but it was really then focused along how do we actually build this relationship? And as Grace said, it was getting down to actually just taking accountability and accepting responsibility for what our role was, and then being open, honest and transparent about the situation that we were in. But that was not just with the MPI. I had to do that across the whole organisation, across the whole industry, out with farmers. Because ultimately they were the ones who were being impacted by this. And then it was about setting some really clear expectations about how we were going to behave and what we wanted from each other. We were working on the NAIT Amendment Bill number 2 at that time. So there was I spent a hell of a lot of time down at MPI. And it was then really sort of about how do we get things back on track? What were the objectives of the scheme? And internally in our own organisation, the board realised that, as Grace said, you've got to have the right people with the right skills. So we saw quite a major reshuffle. So there's a lot more people now in the organisation who come from regulatory backgrounds, who have worked in this area. So we bring the right skill sets to the table. We're used to working in third-party situations with government agencies in those regulatory space. So like our Chief Information Officer, John Tucker, he came from FishServe. Another sort of organisation in a similar setting. So we've got an executive team and a management team that are able to sort of work more closely with government and ensure that this relationship works really well.
And I think it is a relationship. I mean, Deb, just in terms of your experience of these things, and also, with the connection that you have with GREG, which commercial break and plug here for GREG in terms of capability, which I think Gray and Kevin are both pointing to. What do you say are the skills that we as regulators need to focus on when we're looking at getting into relationships of this kind?
Yeah, I think interestingly, I think they're very similar to the skills that we need as regulators anyway.
Yeah.
So my 3 points earlier about how to be good custodians of a system like this. Firstly, I couldn't agree more with Gray and Kevin about relationships and actually making sure that everyone understands the special part they play in relation to the work that the regulator is seeking to carry out. So that's not necessarily easy, but I think that regulators have a story to tell, and in the context of that story, which is about how we're going to reduce harm or how we're going to improve, situations, whatever the story is, in the context of that, there's a part that each of the parties will play, and making sure that everyone understands that is really important. So I'm going to start with why, if you like. And then the other parts of the skills that are needed to really make this work well is that we have to know what it is that the third party is doing in terms of meeting its objectives. So there's ways to do that, whether it's contractually, but also followed up by regular visits or a monitoring program, some kind of oversight and assurance program. It's really essential, and it can get regulators into trouble if it's not done well. And I think the other thing is that, entry to a system is really important. If it requires an authorization or a certification to engage a third party, making sure you're thinking about the right things. Is this third party capable of doing the thing that you're asking them to do? How do you know that it's capable? And all of the things that you would test in a kind of traditional regulatory environment need to come into this. And then what happens if it goes wrong? So are you able to exit the arrangement? or how might you exit the arrangement? Is there an enforcement option for you if it's a legislative framework that creates this partnership or third-party situation? So there's quite a lot to think about, but it's if you like, standard fare for regulators that are thinking about capability and doing their jobs well anyway.
Great stuff, Deb. And standard fare makes me think about food, and it is Friday, and also popcorn. And members of the audience, it is just slightly over half time, and we do customarily like to get you involved. You're being a bit quiet this morning, and I think you might be wanting to ask some questions. But in any event, we're going to ask you some. The popcorn poll, which we normally put out around about this time. How are you feeling with the state of the planet or the state of the conference? In terms of the song title, are you Pharrell Williams happy? Are you Joan Jett frustrated? Or are you a bit Led Zepp and dazed and confused? Off you go, members of the audience. I just want to ask you something, Grace. It's a point that you started with, which I think you said something like the regulator is always the regulator. You know, in the real world, regulators and agencies are contracting, you know, doing the business of government. But actually, if I can put it this way, when mud sticks, it still comes back to the regulators. I just wondered if you wanted to develop that point a bit.
Sorry, Ian.
Did you? We may have an audio dropout problem. I was just saying, Gray, that it was a point that you started this webinar with by saying the regulator is always the regulator. Really, whether or not they're delegating their powers out, contracting out, if there's something that perhaps doesn't go quite right, the focus always goes off onto the regulator rather than the contractor, or at least invariably there's a risk of that.
Absolutely. Look, couldn't agree more. Absolutely. You know, regardless of the fact that it's contracted out, who at the end of the day is a responsible agency, and really it comes back to who's the responsible agency for the piece of legislation. And the Ministry for Primary Industries, MPI, is the responsible agency for the NAIC Act. So the buck stops there, and you know, and even when we get into the detail around the Act, you know, it points to our agricultural minister as being the responsible minister, and so even up through the agency, it comes back to the minister. And although he has the ability to dictate, for example, in this situation, who NAIT Limited may be assigned to, the reality is if it doesn't go right, it's firstly MPI's responsibility to explain to the minister what's gone wrong or what's going well. So yeah, always, doesn't matter how many layers out in front of the responsible agency you have, it's your problem with it if it doesn't quite go as it's supposed to.
Thank you for that, Gray. We're coming back into a raft of questions now. Of course, members of the audience, you can vote on them, put the thumbs up. You've already done that. Question for Kevin from Pippa. Can you tell us, please, how in practice you keep the boards of the Osprey companies to a governance frame, I guess, given the nature of the structure?
I wouldn't say it's so much that I do. So, look, I think the boards operate within the general framework for any governance board, any company, in regards to the way they manage the organisation. Keeping them focused on the governance levels really comes down to the relationship between the chair and the chief executive, and ensuring that the board's focusing on the right issues. So, you know, I think in any organisation such as Osprey, particularly when we've been through the challenges that we've been through, the board obviously wants a closer level of detail around the operational aspects. But our chair is very experienced, and our chief executive is very experienced, and they managed to keep that separation and focused on what those responsibilities are. The NAIT Act is very prescriptive in regards to what the board's powers, functions and duties are, and we are independently audited against those, the NAIT organisation, and they have to report to the minister on those. We also have a lot of external oversight, so we frequently are up before the Primary Production Select Committee. As a private company, that's quite unusual, but our programs are both under regulatory schemes. So as a co-regulator, while we may be a private company, we have a great deal of public oversight to hold us accountable.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I've seen some of the questions here, and this is to you, Kevin, and indeed to the panel. To what extent is this arguably the privatisation of the legislative process and legislation, notwithstanding the structure?
look, I wouldn't necessarily say it was privatisation of it. And I did have a look at the question there, particularly around setting standards and secondary regulation. The way that the NAIT Act is structured, it's quite prescriptive and restrictive as to what we can set secondary legislation on, and the consultation process for us to go through to set that. So under my tenure, we have a standards working group, which includes MPI, policy, compliance, legal, as well as all the affected parties. So nothing gets to secondary legislation point without everybody signing off on it.
Yes.
So very similar to the way that a notice would be done, say, under the Animal Products Act. The minister also has the power to overturn any standard that I put in place. So if he's not happy with it, he can strike it down. I did interestingly seek broader powers when we're going through the NAIT Amendment Bill to have less restriction on my ability to create standards. And I correctly and politely got told by the Select Committee that that was a power that sat with Parliament, so keeping us in check. Because there are powers within the Act that allowed the minister to exercise those broader standard settings. So I think the government has done the right thing in keeping us very closely controlled and on a tight leash when it comes to those sort of powers.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Kevin. And I think one thing that it asks into is building the public-private relationship is even more crucial when you have delicacies of this kind. And as Jane's pointing out, building the functioning or effective relationship in the question that Jane has. How do you deal with conflicts of interest in that sense? And I'm not just really anchoring it to this particular structure, but perhaps I'll bring Deb in on this one. Just generally, in the real world, we have public-private dealing. Conflict of interest can rear its ugly head as a potential, if not actual. What are the kind of generic safeguards that we look to protect against that in your experience, Deb?
Yeah, so it's a tricky question, I think, because again, within our own ranks, so to speak, we have to think about conflicts of interest as well. And sometimes within our own shop, we'll have people that have come from industry, and how do we, there's an interesting challenge, I think, in relation to people that have come from industry that have to learn how to be regulators, and people, but they bring some valuable skills and expertise that is absolutely essential for the regulator. So, how do you kind of induct them or train them or create a situation, an environment, a context for them to understand where they might be conflicted or where they might be making decisions that are unwise if something were to go wrong and it was in the light of day. So I think building into the contracts that, things must be declared, the sorts of things that you'd expect to see, and kind of having a knowledge and intuition, if you like, about the areas that might create conflicts of interest. And,
Yes.
Earlier I talked about what are the profit incentives for the third party or the partnership, and how might you navigate that area, if the profit incentives are driving certain behaviour towards, favourable decisions and things like that. So I think making extra checks and having quality assurance programs in place can help all of that.
I think those are overall wise words that perhaps govern the spirit of the subject that we're looking today. That's all we have time for. We could carry on talking about this, and maybe members of the audience, you'd like us to let us know what your thoughts are. Write to me at GREG, or we will be putting out across next week a wider survey of how you found these webinars and the films as a conference package, what you'd like to hear more of. There's already, if you like, a clarion call for capability that's come from our speakers today, and its importance. Commercial break again. GREG has a part to play in that. Our thanks to Deb, Gray and Kevin today, and to all our contributors across the series, and of course members of the audience, to you wherever and whenever you are. Thank you very much for watching this and any other of the 12 items that have taken the GREG conference another year forward. And until next time, and until next year, from all of us here on the team, stay safe, stay well, and ka kite anō.